In tonight's Tax Insider, the budget deficit. Today, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released a sobering report. It finds this year's budget deficit will rise to $544 billion. That's an increase over prior estimates. For more, I'm joined by Steve Ellis, Vice President of the nonpartisan Taxpayers for Common Sense. Steve, let's start there. Last year's deficit registered $439 billion, the lowest of President Obama's term in office. Why is it rising again?
Well, one thing is, Morris, just a kind of a quirk in the calendar, but almost half of that increase, that $105 billion increase, is because October 1st, the beginning of fiscal year 2017, falls on a Saturday, and so about $43 billion worth of payments are going to be done on September 30th, 2016, in fiscal year 2016 rather than in fiscal year 2017. But you're still talking about a big jump in the deficit, and some of the ways that this is attributed to, could be attributed to, according to the CBO, has been one thing was that, if you recall, and we talked about this last year, the taxibus, the large omnibus spending, but also tax provisions that went into effect that made a lot of tax provisions permanent and extended some other ones, and that's added a lot of to the deficit as well.
Now, the national debt was a top political issue a few years ago. We all remember the 2010 Tea Party wave. What happened, Steve? Why did it fall out of prominence in Washington?
Well, you got to remember some of the shock that led to that wave, Morris. And so when you think back, you realize you were right after the passage of Obamacare, and there was concerns about future costs from that. You also had the issue of the stimulus had just been rolled out before that, and you had, all that increased spending coupled with a lot of reduced revenue because of the Great Recession. And so you had these enormous deficits. We're talking over $1 trillion. And so that definitely gave rise to this concern and put a lot of the Tea Party members into Congress. Problem is that once these people are here for a little while, they start figuring out there's certain things they want to spend their money on. Some of their other colleagues have some other things they want to spend their money on. And they basically all get together and agree that they'll scratch their back if they scratch theirs. And next thing you know, you have something like the taxibus, and you have increasing budget deficits. Politics
as usual. The deficit is about 3% of the U.S. economy. Experts say it's not a short-term concern. The big picture is more dire. Explain that.
Sure. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that the overall economy is about $18 trillion, and so 3% of a big number is still a pretty big number. And then not only that, it's supposed to be getting worse as time goes along. And so if you look 10 years out in 2026, you're looking at almost 5% of GDP being in the budget deficit. And then also when you look at sort of the debt to GDP ratio, right now we're looking at about 75% of the budget the debt, which is all those annual deficits added up, is about 75% of the size of GDP. In 10 years' time, we're looking at more than 85% of GDP.
Steve, this spring, Congress will start another budget debate. What do you expect?
Well, one thing that they did that helps them is that last year they passed the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015 that actually then made it so that it set the top line spending levels for fiscal year 2017. So when the president's budget rolls out on February 9th, everybody's going to know pretty much what the top line discretionary spending level is. Then Congress pretty quickly will turn around and make their own budget resolution. The one sticky wicket in this whole thing maybe is the overseas contingency operations, which is this Pentagon slush fund that they use for war fighting. That's not subject to those caps, and so we may see a lot of cash being stuffed into that account to avoid the caps.
Interesting. We all want to know this next question and answer. What happens if lawmakers in the White House keep kicking this can down the road? What's the worst case scenario?
Well, you have to remember that we've got a demographic wave. As the baby boomers retire, we're seeing greater and greater expenses in Social Security and Medicare and those entitlement programs. And one other thing to keep in mind, and this is kind of a double-edged sword, as the economy grows, so will interest rates, and so will the cost of servicing that massive debt that I talked about. Last year, it was about $223 billion that we paid in interest on that debt. In 10 years' time, we're talking about $830 billion just paying interest on that debt, just on that credit card payment. And that's, to put that in perspective, that's more than $200 billion more than what we spend on the Pentagon right now.
Wow, the numbers are mind-boggling. Thanks for following the money for us. Steve Ellis with Taxpayers for Common Sense. We'll see you next time, Steve.
Thank you, Morris.